Welcome to Ancient Relics Keeper, where forgotten civilizations, unexplained wonders, and ancient secrets come back to life. Ready to unravel the mystery? Let's begin the journey. Almost every ancient culture on Earth tells a story of a great flood, a time when the world was drowned by a divine cataclysm. We know the story of Noah's Ark, but it is just one of hundreds of similar tales from every corner of the globe. Are these just myths, or are they the fragmented memories of a real global disaster? We will investigate the geological evidence for ancient cataclysms that could be the truth behind the legends. In the collective memory of humankind, there are certain stories that are so powerful, so fundamental, that they seem to be woven into the very fabric of our consciousness. These are the archetypal tales of the hero with 1,000 faces, of the battle between light and darkness, of the creation of the world from a formless void. But among all these foundational narratives, one story stands out for its sheer, terrifying consistency across cultures separated by vast oceans and millennia of time. It is the story of the Great Flood, a tale of a world submerged, a humanity nearly extinguished, and a new beginning born from the waters of a global catastrophe. We in the Western world are most familiar with the biblical account of Noah and his ark, a story so ingrained in our culture that it has become a cornerstone of faith and a staple of childhood lore. But what if Noah's story was not unique? What if it was merely one local chapter in a much larger global saga? When we begin to look beyond the familiar pages of Genesis and cast our gaze across the full spectrum of human mythology, a startling and profound pattern begins to emerge. From the dusty plains of ancient Mesopotamia to the misty highlands of South America, from the sacred texts of India to the oral traditions of the Australian Aboriginals, the story repeats itself with an eerie and persistent rhythm. It is a universal echo, a shared memory of a drowned world. To understand the true depth of this mystery, we must first trace this pattern, following the story back to its oldest known source, to a land between two rivers where civilization itself was born. Our journey begins in the sun-scorched landscape of ancient Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now modern-day Iraq. It was here more than 5,000 years ago that the Sumerian civilization blossomed, giving the world its first cities, its first laws, and most importantly for our story, its first written language. On baked clay tablets, inscribed with the wedge-shaped script known as cuneiform, the Sumerians and their successors, the Akkadians and Babylonians, recorded their history, their poetry, and their myths. And it was here, buried for thousands of years in the ruins of ancient libraries, that archaeologists in the 19th century made a discovery that would shake the foundations of biblical history. They unearthed the fragments of a sprawling epic poem, one of the oldest surviving works of literature in the world, the Epic of Gilgamesh. The story follows the adventures of Gilgamesh, the heroic king of the city of Uruk, on his quest for immortality. Heartbroken by the death of his friend Enkidu, Gilgamesh embarks on a perilous journey to the ends of the earth to find the only man who has ever escaped death, a wise old sage named Utnapishtim. When Gilgamesh finally finds him, he asks Utnapishtim the secret of his eternal life. The old man's reply is the heart of our mystery. He recounts a story from the dawn of time, a story of a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humankind. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh that the gods, led by the powerful and capricious Enlil, had grown weary of the noise and clamor of humanity and decided, in their divine council, to wipe them from the face of the earth with a devastating deluge. However, one god, the god of wisdom and water, took pity on humankind. He secretly went to Utnapishtim, a devout and righteous man, and spoke to him through the reed wall of his house, warned him of the impending doom and gave him a very specific set of instructions. Tear down your house and build a boat. Abandon possessions and look for life. Spurn property and save life. Take aboard the boat the seed of all living things. They provided Utnapishtim with precise dimensions for the vessel, a massive, cube-shaped ark with 7 decks, each divided into 9 compartments. Utnapishtim followed the god's command. He gathered his family, his craftsmen, and the seed of all living things, both domestic and wild, and sealed them all inside the great boat. No sooner had he sealed the door than the cataclysm began. A terrifying storm rose up, so violent that even the gods themselves cowered in fear. For 6 days and 7 nights, the winds blew and the waters raged, submerging the entire world. Utnapishtim describes the scene with chilling finality. All of humanity had returned to clay. When the storm finally subsided on the 7th day, he opened a window and looked out upon a silent, watery landscape. The boat had come to rest on the peak of a mountain called Mount Nizur. To test if the waters had receded, he sent out a dove, which found no place to land and returned. Then he sent out a swallow, which also returned. Finally, he sent out a raven, which saw that the waters had withdrawn, found food, and did not return. Knowing it was safe, Utnapishtim and his family emerged from the ark and made a sacrifice to the gods. The god Enlil, who had caused the flood, was initially furious that some humans had survived. But the wise god Ea interceded, and Enlil relented, blessing Utnapishtim and his wife and granting them immortality for preserving life on earth. The story, discovered thousands of years after it was written, is a masterpiece of ancient literature. But its true significance lies in its shocking parallels to a story that would be written down centuries later, a story that would become one of the most famous in the world. For billions of people around the globe, the definitive story of the Great Flood is the one found in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Hebrew Bible. The tale of Noah's Ark is a cornerstone of the Judeo-Christian and Islamic faiths, a powerful narrative of divine judgment, destruction, and redemption. The story begins in a world that has become filled with wickedness and corruption. God, seeing the depravity of humankind, regrets his creation and decides to cleanse the earth with a great flood. However, the Bible tells us that Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Because of his virtue, God chooses to save Noah and his family, and through them to preserve life on earth. God speaks directly to Noah, warning him of the coming cataclysm, and giving him a detailed blueprint for a vessel of salvation. He instructs Noah to build an ark of cypress wood, giving him its exact dimensions in cubits and specifying its 3 decks and a roof. God's instructions are clear. Noah is to bring his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives into the ark. He is also commanded to bring aboard 2 of every kind of living creature, male and female, along with enough food to sustain them all through the coming ordeal. Noah, in his faithfulness, does everything just as God commanded him. He builds the massive ark, a project that, according to tradition, took many decades, during which he was mocked by his wicked neighbors. When the vessel is complete, the animals come to him, 2 by 2, and he, his family, and all the creatures enter the ark. Then God himself shuts the door. The cataclysm that follows is described as coming from 2 sources. All the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and the waters rose until every high mountain on the face of the earth was covered. Every living thing that moved on land, people, animals, and birds perished. Only Noah and those with him in the ark were left alive. The waters flooded the earth for 150 days. Eventually, God remembers Noah, and the waters begin to recede. The ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat. After many more days, Noah seeks to determine if the land is dry. Just like his Mesopotamian predecessor, he uses birds as his messengers. First, he sends out a raven which flies back and forth. Then he sends out a dove which returns unable to find a perch. He waits 7 days and sends the dove out again. This time it returns in the evening with a freshly plucked olive leaf in its beak, a sign that the waters have subsided. After another 7 days, he sends the dove out a 3rd time, and it does not return. Knowing the earth is dry, Noah, his family, and all the animals emerge from the ark onto a cleansed and renewed world. Noah builds an altar and makes a sacrifice to God, who is pleased and makes a covenant, a sacred promise with Noah and all living creatures. God sets a rainbow in the clouds as a sign of this covenant, promising that never again will he destroy all life with the waters of a flood. When the Epic of Gilgamesh was deciphered in the 19th century, the parallels between the story of Utnapishtim and the story of Noah were so stark and so numerous that they caused a sensation. The similarities were undeniable: a divine decision to destroy humanity with a flood, a warning given to a single righteous hero, a specific command to build a large boat and save his family and animals, the sealing of the door, the grounding of the vessel on a mountain, the use of birds to test the water levels, and the final sacrifice of thanksgiving. The Mesopotamian account was demonstrably older than the biblical one by at least 1,000 years. This discovery forced a profound reevaluation of the origins of the biblical narrative. For many scholars, it became clear that the story of Noah was not a unique divine revelation, but was part of a much older and more widespread mythological tradition in the ancient Near East. The Hebrew people, during their time in and around Mesopotamia, had likely inherited this ancient story and adapted it to fit their own monotheistic theology, replacing the squabbling pantheon of Mesopotamian gods with the singular, just God of the Bible. This connection alone is a fascinating piece of literary and religious history. But the mystery deepens when we realize that this same basic story was not confined to the Middle East. It appears with startling consistency in cultures that had absolutely no contact with Mesopotamia or the ancient Israelites. The moment we expand our search beyond the ancient Near East, the flood myth transforms from a regional tradition into a truly global phenomenon. It is as if a great cataclysmic event left an indelible psychic scar on the entire human species, a scar that manifested as a recurring story in cultures all over the world. Let us travel from Mesopotamia to ancient Greece. Here, the poet Ovid tells the story of Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha. The god Zeus, disgusted by the wickedness of humanity during the Iron Age, decides to wipe them out with a massive flood. But the Titan Prometheus, who had created humanity and still cared for them, warns his son Deucalion of the impending disaster. He advises Deucalion to build a chest or an ark. Deucalion and Pyrrha float in their vessel for 9 days and 9 nights as the floodwaters cover the earth, extinguishing all other life. Their chest finally comes to rest on the peak of Mount Parnassus. When the waters recede, they make a sacrifice and are told by an oracle how to repopulate the earth. They are to throw the bones of their mother, meaning the stones of Mother Earth, over their shoulders. The stones thrown by Deucalion become men, and those thrown by Pyrrha become women. Now let us cross continents to ancient India. In the sacred Hindu texts, including the Shatapatha Brahmana and the Mahabharata, we find the story of a wise man named Manu. One day, while he is washing his hands, a tiny fish swims into them and begs for protection. Manu keeps the fish, moving it to progressively larger containers as it grows at a miraculous rate. The fish, who is an avatar of the god Vishnu, eventually reveals to Manu that a great flood is coming that will destroy all creatures. He instructs Manu to build a large ship and to take aboard the seeds of all plants and the 7 great sages. When the flood comes, Manu ties his ship to the horn of the great fish, who safely guides the vessel through the turbulent waters until it comes to rest on a mountain in the Himalayas. Manu, the sole human survivor, then performs a sacrifice, from which a woman, Ida, is born. Together, they become the progenitors of the new human race. The pattern continues as we move to the Americas. The indigenous peoples of North, Central, and South America have a staggering number of flood myths, estimated to be in the hundreds. The Hopi people of the American Southwest tell of a previous world that was destroyed by a flood when its people became corrupt. The virtuous were saved by the sky god Sotuknang, who sealed them in reeds and allowed them to float on the waters. In Central America, the Mayan sacred text, the Popol Vuh, describes several attempts by the gods to create humanity. One of these attempts, a race of men made from wood, proves to be heartless and disrespectful. The gods destroy them with a flood of hot resin that rains from the sky, combined with the great deluge from the earth. In the Andes of South America, the Inca tells stories of a flood sent by the creator god Viracocha to destroy a race of giants who had disobeyed him. He saved two of his creations, Manco Capac and Mama Oclo, who then founded the Inca dynasty. Even in the most remote corners of the globe, the story is present. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia, whose culture is one of the oldest on Earth, have stories of a dreamtime flood that reshaped the landscape. In the islands of the Pacific, from Hawaii to Polynesia, there are numerous legends of floods and great waves that destroyed ancestral lands. The sheer geographical and cultural diversity of these stories is the core of the mystery. These cultures were separated by immense distances and had no known means of communication with one another. The ancient Greeks had no contact with the Inca. The Hindus of India did not share stories with the Hopi of Arizona. Yet, they all tell a strikingly similar tale. This universal pattern strongly suggests that they were not all independently inventing the same story. It points towards a shared origin, a common source. And that source, many researchers believe, was not a shared myth, but a shared memory of a real global event. When we strip away the cultural details, the specific names of the gods, the heroes, and the Mountainsa core narrative emerges from these global myths with stunning clarity. This narrative can be broken down into a series of recurring, archetypal elements, a shared DNA that runs through almost all the stories. The first and most fundamental element is the reason for the flood, a divine judgment. In almost every tale, the flood is not a random natural disaster. It is a deliberate act, a punishment sent by a deity or a group of gods who have become displeased with the state of humanity. The cause of this displeasure is almost always a moral failing, wickedness, corruption, disobedience, or a loss of respect for the divine. This frames the cataclysm not as a tragedy, but as a necessary cosmic cleansing, a way to wipe the slate clean and begin the world anew. This element transforms the story from a simple survival tale into a profound moral and theological drama. The second core element is the divine warning and the chosen survivor. Amidst the general corruption, there is always one individual or one family who is deemed righteous and worthy of salvation. This Herobit Utnapishtim, Noah, Deucalion, or Manuus given a direct warning of the coming disaster by a benevolent god or a sympathetic messenger. This warning is never vague. It is specific and practical. It is not just a prophecy of doom, but a set of instructions for survival. This element is crucial because it introduces the theme of hope and divine providence. Even in the face of total annihilation, there is a plan for preservation. Humanity is not to be completely extinguished. A seed is to be saved. The third, and perhaps most iconic, element is the construction of a vessel of salvation. The hero is always instructed to build a Boatan ark, a chest, a ship to ride out the storm. The stories often provide remarkably specific details about the vessel's construction, its materials, its dimensions, its design with multiple decks or compartments. This focus on the ark is significant. It is the technological solution to a divine problem, a symbol of human ingenuity working in concert with divine grace. The ark is a microcosm of the old world, a floating sanctuary that carries the seeds of the new. Inside this vessel, the hero is commanded to save not only his own family but also a representation of all life, often in the form of pairs of animals or the seeds of plants. This emphasizes that the goal is not just human survival, but the preservation of the entire ecosystem, the restoration of the world in its totality. The fourth shared element is the cataclysm itself, and the eventual salvation on a mountaintop. The flood is always described as a global, all-encompassing event. The waters rise to cover the highest mountains, wiping out all life that is not protected within the ark. After a period of chaos, the waters begin to recede, and the vessel comes to rest on the peak of a high mountain. This mountain Ararat, Nizar, Parnassus, or a Himalayan peak becomes the cradle of the New World, the first piece of dry land to emerge from the waters. It is a sacred place, the point of connection between the drowned world of the past and the reborn world of the future. The use of birds to test for dry land is a surprisingly specific and recurring detail in both the Mesopotamian and biblical accounts, suggesting a very deep, shared root for these particular traditions. Finally, the story almost always concludes with the hero and the survivors emerging from the ark to make a sacrifice of thanksgiving to the gods. This act of worship reestablishes the proper relationship between humanity and the divine, and it is often followed by a covenant or a promise that such a devastating flood will not happen again. The rainbow in the story of Noah is the most famous example of this promise, a beautiful and hopeful symbol emerging from a story of utter destruction. The survivors then go on to repopulate the earth, becoming the ancestors of all present-day humanity. This universal pattern, this shared narrative architecture, is too consistent and too widespread to be easily dismissed as mere coincidence. It begs for an explanation, and it points strongly towards the possibility that all of these myths are the distant, distorted echoes of a single real world-altering event that left an indelible mark on the memory of our species. The universal pattern of the Great Flood myth presents us with a profound historical puzzle. The striking similarities in these stories from cultures all over the world seem to demand a common origin. For centuries, the only explanation was a supernatural, only literal, global flood sent by a divine power. But in the modern age of science, researchers have begun to search for a different kind of answer, one grounded not in theology but in geology. They have started to ask, could a real, observable, and scientifically verifiable natural disaster have been the historical seed for these powerful myths? This quest has led scientists to scour the globe for evidence of ancient cataclysms, looking for an event large enough, traumatic enough, and recent enough to have been seared into the memory of early human societies. And in the late 1990s, two respected geologists from Columbia University, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, proposed a theory that was as elegant as it was dramatic. They argued that the origin of the most influential flood myths, the Mesopotamian and biblical stories, was not a global event, but a massive and truly catastrophic regional flood. Their focus was on a body of water that sits at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, the Black Sea. Their theory, known as the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, suggests that a very real and terrifying flood in this region became the historical kernel that grew into the legend of Noah's Ark. To understand the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, we must first travel back in time to the end of the last ice age, roughly 9,000 years ago. The world at this time was a very different place. Massive ice sheets that had covered much of North America and Europe were in a state of retreat, melting at a dramatic rate and pouring vast quantities of fresh water into the world's oceans. Global sea levels were rising, but not uniformly. The geography of the Black Sea region was also profoundly different. Today, the Black Sea is a large, deep, saltwater body, connected to the Mediterranean Sea, and thus to the world's oceans, through a narrow, winding channel known as the Bosphorus Strait, which runs through the modern-day city of Istanbul. But according to the theory proposed by Ryan and Pittman, this was not always the case. Based on their analysis of sediment cores drilled from the floor of the Black Sea, they painted a picture of a very different ancient landscape. They argued that around 7500 BC, the Black Sea was not a sea at all. It was a giant, isolated freshwater lake. Its surface was several hundred feet lower than the level of the Mediterranean Sea, and it was completely cut off from the ocean by a natural dam, a high ridge of land at the site of the present-day Bosphorus. This ancient freshwater lake would have been a paradise for early human settlement. The climate was mild, and the shores of the lake would have been a vast, fertile plain, crisscrossed by rivers flowing down from the mountains of Europe and Asia. This would have been an ideal location for the Neolithic Revolution, the momentous shift from a nomadic, hunter-gatherer lifestyle to a settled agricultural oneto take root. Ryan and Pittman envisioned this lost shoreline as a vibrant heartland of early farming communities. People would have built villages, cultivated crops, and raised livestock on the rich, alluvial soil. It would have been a peaceful, stable, and prosperous world. A Garden of Eden for the first farmers of southeastern Europe. They would have had no knowledge of the rising oceans beyond their world, no inkling of the immense hydraulic pressure that was building just a few miles away on the other side of the Bosphorus land bridge. For generations, life on the shores of the great freshwater lake would have been predictable and secure. The people who lived there would have had no reason to believe that their entire world was perched on the edge of a geological knife. The stability of this lakeside paradise was entirely dependent on the integrity of one single crucial piece of geology: the natural dam at the Bosphorus. As long as this land bridge remained intact, the tranquil freshwater lake was safe from the rising waters of the Mediterranean Sea. But the dam was not destined to hold forever. As the great ice sheets of the Ice Age continued to melt, the global sea level crept inexorably higher. The Mediterranean, fed by this immense volume of meltwater, rose year after year, inch by inch, pressing with ever-increasing force against the Bosphorus sill. The pressure difference between the high saltwater of the Mediterranean and the low freshwater of the Black Sea Lake created a situation of extreme geological tension. It was a time bomb set by the changing climate of the planet. And according to Ryan and Pittman's theory, around 5600 BC, that time bomb finally exploded. The exact trigger for the breach is a matter of debate. It could have been a powerful earthquake in this seismically active region that cracked the dam. Or perhaps the rising water simply found a weak point, a small channel, and began to erode it. But once the breach occurred, the result was inevitable and catastrophic. The barrier that had held back the sea for thousands of years gave way. The salt water of the Mediterranean began to pour through the opening and cascade down into the low-lying freshwater lake. The initial trickle would have quickly become a torrent, as the immense force of the water carved a wider and deeper channel through the soft rock and soil of the land bridge. Within a very short period of time, the Bosphorus Strait as we know it today was born, not through a slow, gradual process, but in a single violent geological convulsion. The breaking of the dam was the moment that the world changed for the people living around the Black Sea. It was the beginning of a deluge of biblical proportions, an event so powerful that it would leave a permanent scar on the landscape and, Ryan and Pittman argue, on the memory of humankind. The image that William Ryan and Walter Pittman paint of the Black Sea flood is one of almost unimaginable power and terror. This was not a gentle rising tide. It was a cataclysmic inundation. Once the Bosphorus Dam was breached, the Mediterranean Sea began to pour into the Black Sea basin through the newly formed channel. Ryan and Pittman calculated the sheer scale of this event. They estimated that the water cascaded downwards with a force 200 times greater than that of Niagara Falls. Every single day, more than 10 cubic miles of saltwater of volume, that would dwarf the daily flow of the Amazon River roared through the Bosphorus and into the lake. The sound alone would have been deafening, a constant, thunderous roar that would have been audible for hundreds of miles. For the people living on the fertile plains around the lake, this would have been the sound of their world ending. The effect on the lake itself was immediate and devastating. The water level began to rise at a staggering rate, estimated to be as much as 6 inches to a foot per day. This relentless advance of the shoreline would have been terrifying to witness. It was not a flood that one could escape by simply moving to higher ground. The water was rising too fast, consuming the land at a rate of up to a mile a day in the flatter coastal areas. Every day, the farmers would wake up to find that the sea had crept closer, swallowing their fields, their homes, and their sacred sites. Their entire world was being systematically drowned before their very eyes. The flood was not a temporary event that would recede in a few weeks. It continued day after day, month after month, for what might have seemed like an eternity. Ryan and Pittman estimate that the inundation may have lasted for the better part of a year, or perhaps even longer, until the level of the Black Sea finally rose to meet the level of the Mediterranean, and a new, stable equilibrium was reached. By the time the flood was over, the geography of the region had been transformed. More than 60,000 square miles of coastal land and area, the size of the state of Florida, had been submerged beneath the waves. The once freshwater lake had become a salty, marine environment, its original ecosystem completely destroyed. The effect on the human population would have been catastrophic. The inhabitants of this lost world would have been forced to flee in a desperate, mass exodus. They would have grabbed what few possessions they could and abandoned their villages, becoming the world's first climate refugees. They would have scattered in all directions, west into Europe, east into Asia, and south into Anatolia and Mesopotamia, carrying with them nothing but the traumatic memory of their drowned homeland. It is this traumatic memory, Ryan and Pittman argue, that became the historical source for the Great Flood myths. Imagine the stories these survivors would have told their children and their grandchildren. They would have spoken of a golden age, a time when they lived in a paradise by a sweetwater sea. They would have described how the world was suddenly and violently destroyed by a roaring salty deluge that came from a narrow channel. They would have told tales of a desperate flight from the rising waters, a story of loss and survival against impossible odds. As these stories were passed down through the generations, they would have been embellished and transformed. The natural geological event would have been reinterpreted through a mythological lens. The roar of the Bosphorus waterfall would become the angry voice of the gods. The relentless rise of the waters would be seen as a divine punishment. The survivors of the Exodus would become the chosen few, the righteous family saved by a benevolent deity. The story of the Black Sea deluge, a real and terrifying regional catastrophe, had all the necessary ingredients to become the legend of the Great Flood. The theory provides a specific time, a specific place, and a specific mechanism for the origin of the stories that would eventually be written down in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Book of Genesis. It grounds the most famous flood myth in the world in a verifiable geological reality. The evidence for this dramatic event, according to its proponents, can still be found today, hidden in the mud at the bottom of the Black Sea. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis offers a compelling and scientifically grounded explanation for the flood myths of the ancient Near East. It provides a specific time, a specific place, and a specific mechanism for a catastrophic flood that could have been seared into the memory of early agricultural societies. It is an elegant theory that neatly connects geology with mythology. However, it is not without its limitations. The Black Sea flood, while massive and terrifying, was ultimately a regional event. Its direct impact would have been felt by the people living around the Black Sea basin. While their stories might have spread as they migrated, it struggles to fully account for the truly global nature of the flood myth. How could a regional flood in southeastern Europe have inspired near-identical stories in the Americas, in Australia, and in the remote islands of the Pacific, places that had no conceivable contact with the survivors of the Black Sea event? The universality of the myth seems to demand a truly global cause. This has led some researchers to look for evidence of a different kind of cataclysm, an event so vast and so powerful that its effects would have been felt simultaneously on every continent on Earth. This search has led them to a mysterious and turbulent period in our planet's recent geological past, a time of abrupt and violent climate change known as the Younger Dryas. It is here, in the story of this ancient cold snap, that a new and far more controversial theory for the Great Flood emerges, one that involves not a rising sea, but a devastating blow from the heavens. To understand this alternative theory, we must first travel back in time to the very end of the last Great Ice Age, approximately 13,000 years ago. At this point, the Earth was in a state of profound transition. For tens of thousands of years, the planet had been in the grip of a deep freeze. Massive ice sheets, miles thick, covered most of Canada, the northern United States, and much of northern Europe. But the deep freeze was ending. The planet was on a steady and significant warming trend. The great glaciers were melting, sea levels were rising, and a more temperate, hospitable climate was beginning to spread across the globe. Forests were expanding, and the megafauna of the Ice Age, the woolly mammoths, the saber-toothed cats, the giant ground sloths roamed the newly greening landscapes. For the early humans of this period, known to archaeologists as the Clovis people in North America, it was a time of relative abundance and opportunity. It seemed as though the world was finally shrugging off the long winter and heading towards a more stable, warmer future. And then something went terribly wrong. Around 12,800 years ago, this steady warming trend came to an abrupt and catastrophic halt. Seemingly out of nowhere, the planet's climate system was thrown into reverse. Global temperatures plummeted, and the Earth was plunged back into a period of near-glacial cold that would last for over 1,000 years. This sudden, anomalous cold snap is known to geologists and climatologists as the Younger Dryas. The evidence for this event is written clearly in the geological record. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica show a dramatic drop in temperature at this precise point in time. Sediment cores from the ocean floor and lake beds all over the world show a sudden change in the types of pollen and microscopic organisms, indicating a rapid shift from warm weather species back to cold weather species. The Younger Dryas was a planetary-scale climatic shock, a brutal 1,000-year winter that interrupted the coming of the global spring. For decades, the cause of this sudden deep freeze was a major scientific puzzle. The leading theory was that a massive freshwater lake in North America, Lake Agassiz, which was formed by the melting glaciers, suddenly burst its ice dam and drained into the North Atlantic Ocean. This immense influx of fresh water would have shut down the ocean's thermohaline circulation, the great conveyor belt of currents that brings warm water to the North Atlantic, triggering a rapid cooling of the Northern Hemisphere. This was a plausible explanation, but in recent years a new, more explosive theory has emerged, one that suggests the Younger Dryas was not caused by a flood, but that it, in turn, caused one. This new and highly controversial theory is known as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. First proposed in 2007 by a team of respected scientists led by Richard Firestone, Alan West, and James Kennett, the theory argues that the sudden onset of the Younger Dryas cold period was triggered by a cataclysmic cosmic event. They proposed that around 12,800 years ago, the Earth passed through the debris stream of a large, disintegrating comet. This resulted in a swarm of cometary fragments, some potentially several kilometers in diameter, crashing into the planet. The primary impact zone, they argue, was the Laurentide ice sheet, the massive glacier that covered most of North America at the time. The theory posits that multiple fragments of this comet either slammed directly into the ice sheet or exploded in massive airbursts above it, similar to the Tunguska event in Siberia in 1908, but on a scale many thousands of times more powerful. The immediate consequences of such an impact would have been apocalyptic. The explosions would have generated a thermal blast of unimaginable heat, instantly vaporizing a significant portion of the ice sheet and throwing vast quantities of water vapor, dust, and cometary debris high into the atmosphere. The impact site itself would have been subjected to immense shock waves, shattering the ground and igniting continent-spanning wildfires. The plume of dust and smoke from these fires, combined with the water vapor from the vaporized ice, would have been so thick that it would have shrouded the globe, blocking out the sun's light and heat. This would have triggered a rapid and dramatic drop in global temperature, an impact winter that perfectly matches the sudden onset of the Younger Dryas cold period. The theory suggests that the climate didn't just change. It was violently broken by a blow from outer space. This is a radical and terrifying idea, one that challenges the conventional, more gradualist view of Earth's history. It suggests that one of the most significant climate shifts of the last 20,000 years was not the result of slow, earthly processes, but was caused by a sudden and violent encounter with the cosmic intruder. The theory was, and still is, highly controversial within the scientific community. Many geologists and archaeologists have raised valid criticisms, and have argued that the evidence is not strong enough to support such an extraordinary claim. However, the proponents of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis argue that the proof is not just theoretical, it is physical. They claim that the cosmic collision left a distinct, physical fingerprint on the planet, a thin, dark layer of Earth that can be found on multiple continents, a geological scar marking the very moment the world changed. For a theory as bold as a comet impact, extraordinary evidence is required. The proponents of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis claim that this evidence exists in the form of a thin, dark layer of sediment, known as a black mat, which can be found at the base of the Younger Dryas geological layer, in archaeological and geological sites all over the world. This black mat is a distinct, carbon-rich layer that directly overlays the last remnants of the Clovis culture in North America and the remains of the extinct Ice Age megafauna. For the scientists who support the impact theory, this black mat is the geological equivalent of a crime scene, a layer of debris that settled out of the atmosphere in the aftermath of the Cataclysm. They have subjected this layer to intense scientific scrutiny, and they claim to have found a cocktail of unusual materials that can only be explained by a cosmic impact event. One of the key pieces of evidence they point to is the presence of nanodiamonds. These are microscopic diamonds that are formed under conditions of extreme temperature and pressure, conditions that are not typically found on the Earth's surface, but are known to be created during extraterrestrial impacts. These tiny diamonds have been found in the black mat layer at multiple sites across North America, and even in Europe. Another key marker is the presence of iridium, a dense metal that is rare in the Earth's crust, but is relatively abundant in asteroids and comets. A spike in iridium concentration in a geological layer is considered a classic signature of a cosmic impact. It was the discovery of a global iridium layer, at the end of the Cretaceous period, that led to the now accepted theory that the dinosaurs were wiped out by an asteroid. Proponents of the Younger Dryas theory claim to have found a similar, albeit smaller, iridium anomaly in the black mat layer. The list of impact markers continues. They have found magnetic spherules, tiny metallic orbs that are formed when rock is melted at extreme temperatures, and then cools rapidly as it flies through the air. They have found carbon spherules and glassy carbon, materials formed by the intense heat of wildfires. And they have found high concentrations of soot, direct evidence of continent-spanning fires that would have raged in the aftermath of the impact. The proponents argue that this unique combination of materials, the nanodiamonds, the iridium, the magnetic spherules, and the soot, all found in a single thin layer dating to precisely 12,800 years ago, cannot be explained by any known terrestrial process, such as volcanism or normal wildfires. The only plausible explanation, they contend, is that this layer represents the fallout from a massive, extraterrestrial impact event. The black mat is, in their view, the smoking gun. It is the physical proof that the Earth was struck by a comet at the end of the Ice Age. The controversy surrounding the theory, however, is intense. Other scientists have challenged these findings, arguing that they have been unable to replicate the results, or that the materials found in the black mat could have been formed by other, less dramatic processes. The debate is ongoing, and is one of the most active and contentious areas of research in modern Earth science. But if the impact proponents are correct, if the Earth was indeed struck by a comet 12,800 years ago, the consequences would have been far-reaching. The event would not only have triggered a 1,000-year-long winter and contributed to the extinction of the megafauna, it would have also, almost instantaneously, caused a flood of truly global proportions. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis provides a mechanism for a genuine planet-spanning flood. The key lies in the location of the proposed impact, the Laurentide ice sheet. At the time of the event, this was a colossal body of ice, in some places up to 2 miles thick, covering a huge portion of North America. The energy released by the impact of multiple cometary fragments onto this ice sheet would have been staggering, far greater than the entire world's nuclear arsenal combined. A significant portion of this energy would have been converted into heat, causing the instantaneous melting and vaporization of a vast quantity of ice. The result would have been a release of fresh water on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. It would have been a meltwater pulse of unprecedented size and speed. This immense volume of water would have been unleashed upon the world in a cataclysmic flood. Rivers of meltwater would have poured off the North American continent and into the surrounding oceans. This sudden massive influx of fresh water would have had two major, immediate effects. First, it would have caused a rapid and dramatic rise in global sea levels. Unlike the slow, gradual rise that occurs over centuries, this would have been a sudden jump, a pulse of water that would have inundated coastal regions all over the planet in a matter of days or weeks. Low-lying coastal plains, where many early human populations are thought to have lived, would have been permanently submerged. The very shape of the continents would have been altered. Second, the impact itself, along with the immense hydraulic pressure of the meltwater pouring into the oceans, would have generated megatsunamis of a scale far beyond anything recorded in human history. These waves would not have been confined to the North Atlantic. They would have propagated across all the world's oceans, crashing onto the shores of Europe, Africa, Asia, and South America. These tsunamis would have scoured coastlines and surged deep inland, destroying everything in their path. The combination of the rapid sea level rise and the globe-spanning tsunamis would have created a genuine worldwide deluge. It would have been a catastrophe experienced not just by one group of people in one region, but by all coastal populations across the entire planet at the same time. This scenario provides a compelling physical basis for the universality of the Great Flood myth. The comet impact theory suggests that nearly every culture on Earth has a flood myth because nearly every culture on Earth experienced the same flood. The survivors of this cataclysm, whether they were in the Americas, Europe, or Asia, would have all witnessed a similar terrifying event, a sudden and violent rising of the sea that destroyed their world. They would have all carried the memory of this trauma with them, passing it down through the generations. The details would have changed. The story would have been adapted to fit their local culture and religion, but the core memory of a world drowned by a great flood would have remained. This theory elegantly explains why the myth is global in scope. It wasn't that the story spread from a single point of origin. It's that the event itself was global, creating the same story independently in many different places. The Younger Dryas impact, if it happened, was not just a climate-changing event. It was a world-drowning event. It provides a single, unified, and terrifyingly plausible cause for the most widespread and enduring myth in human history. We have now explored two powerful scientific theories, each offering a potential origin for the Great Flood myths. We have the Black Sea Deluge, a massive but regional catastrophe that could have been the seed for the foundational stories of the Western world. And we have the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, a truly global cataclysm involving a comet from the heavens that could have triggered a worldwide flood and left a shared scar on the memory of all humankind. Both theories provide a compelling, naturalistic explanation for a story that was once thought to be purely mythological. But this is where our investigation must take a crucial turn. We must move beyond the realm of geology and climatology and enter the world of human psychology, culture, and memory. Because a catastrophe, no matter how large, is just a physical event. It only becomes a myth when it is experienced, interpreted, and retold by human beings. The final and most fascinating part of this puzzle is to understand how a real physical flood, whether regional or global, could have been transformed over thousands of years into the rich, complex, and surprisingly consistent sacred stories that we find all over the world. This is the process of reinterpreting myth not as fiction, but as a form of distorted, traumatic history. The first and most important step in this transformation lies in the nature of human memory, especially memory associated with extreme trauma. An event like the Black Sea Deluge or the Younger Dryas impact would have been the single most terrifying and devastating experience in the history of our species. It was not just a disaster, it was an apocalypse. For the survivors, the world would have been turned upside down. Their homes, their lands, their families, and their entire way of life would have been annihilated in a terrifying maelstrom of water, wind, and darkness. The psychological impact of surviving such an event is almost impossible for us to comprehend. The survivors would have been afflicted with a profound and enduring form of collective post-traumatic stress. Their memories of the event would not have been cool, detached historical recollections. They would have been vivid, nightmarish, and emotionally charged. In a pre-literate society, these powerful memories would have been the only record of the event. There were no books, no newspapers, no digital archives to preserve a factual account. The history was kept alive through oral tradition, passed down from one generation to the next around the campfires of the new post-apocalyptic world. And as any psychologist or historian will tell you, oral traditions are not static. They are fluid, dynamic, and subject to change. As the story of the Great Cataclysm was retold again and again, it would have been shaped and filtered through the lens of human emotion and the need to find meaning in a senseless tragedy. The raw, chaotic details of the event would have been gradually organized into a more coherent narrative. The story would have been simplified, its key elements exaggerated for dramatic effect. The goal was not to create a scientifically accurate report, but to convey the emotional truth of the experience, the terror, the loss, and the miracle of survival. This process of mythologizing a traumatic memory is a fundamental human coping mechanism. It is how we take the unbearable chaos of reality and give it a structure, a purpose, and a moral. The story of the flood would have become the foundational story of the survivor cultures, the central event that divided their history into a before and an after. It would have explained why they were living in a new land, why their ancestors were gone, and why the world they inhabited was so different from the paradise of the world before. The story was not just history, it was identity. It told them who they were and where they came from. And as this sacred history was passed down through the centuries and millennia, a crucial transformation would have occurred in how the cause of the cataclysm was understood. The impersonal forces of geology or astrophysics would have been replaced by the very personal forces of divine will. For an ancient pre-scientific mind, the world was not a machine governed by impersonal physical laws. It was a living, sentient place, animated by powerful, unseen forces and intelligences. The weather was not caused by pressure systems and temperature gradients. It was the mood of the sky god. An earthquake was not the shifting of tectonic plates. It was the stirring of a great beast sleeping beneath the earth. Nature was personal. Therefore, a cataclysm on the scale of the Great Flood could not have been interpreted as a random natural event. Such a devastating and all-encompassing disaster must have had a purpose. It must have been an act of will, and the only will powerful enough to command the oceans to rise and the heavens to open was the will of the gods. This is where the natural event becomes a moral drama. The survivors, struggling to comprehend why their world was destroyed, would have asked themselves a profound question. What did we do to deserve this? In their search for meaning, they would have inevitably concluded that the flood was a punishment. It was a divine judgment upon a world that had become wicked, corrupt, or disrespectful to the gods. The physical destruction of the world becomes a reflection of a moral corruption within humanity. This interpretation is not just a primitive superstition. It is a sophisticated and very human way of imposing order on chaos. It gives the event a reason. It transforms a senseless tragedy into a story with a moral lesson. Our actions have consequences, and there is a cosmic order that we must respect. The cataclysm itself would have been personified. The roaring waters of the Black Sea deluge or the flash of a comet striking the ice would be seen as the direct, physical manifestation of a god's anger. The natural forces become the tools of divine justice. The story of Gilgamesh, where the god Enlil sends the flood because humanity is too noisy, is a perfect example of this. The everyday annoyance of a god becomes the justification for a planetary genocide. In the biblical narrative, the reason is more profound. It is a response to humanity's moral decay. But the underlying principle is the same. The flood is not an accident. It is a deliberate act of divine agency. This process of personifying nature and attributing catastrophic events to the will of the gods is a universal feature of early human religion. It is how our ancestors made sense of a world that was often violent, unpredictable, and terrifying. And it is the key step in transforming the memory of a real flood into the sacred myth of a divine judgment. Within this narrative of near-total destruction, there is always a glimmer of hope, a thread of survival that runs through every version of the myth. This is the story of the chosen hero and the vessel of salvation, the ark. The recurring theme of a boat, a chest, or some other floating refuge is one of the most powerful and enduring symbols in the flood legends. On a purely practical level, it makes sense. In a world being drowned by water, a boat is the only logical means of survival. The survivors of a real coastal flood would likely have been those who managed to cling to floating debris, or who had access to some form of watercraft. The memory of this practical reality would have naturally become a central part of the story. But the ark in the flood myths is much more than just a literal boat. It is a potent and multi-layered symbol. The ark represents the seed of the new world. It is a floating microcosm, a miniature version of the old world that is preserved from the chaos of the flood. Inside its protective walls, the future of life on Earth is sheltered. The command to bring aboard pairs of every animal is a symbolic representation of this. The hero is not just saving himself and his family. He is acting as the custodian of creation, tasked with preserving the biodiversity of the planet, so that the world can be repopulated after the waters recede. The ark is a sanctuary, a sacred space that separates the order and life within from the chaos and death without. It is a symbol of hope in the midst of despair, a testament to the idea that even in the face of total annihilation, life finds a way to endure. The figure of the hero himself, Noah, Utnapishtim, Deucalion, Manuus, also a powerful symbol. He represents the resilience of the human spirit. He is the one righteous individual in a world of corruption, the one person who listens to the divine warning while others mock. His great labor in building the ark is a testament to his faith and perseverance. He is the archetypal survivor, the ancestor of the new humanity. The story of the hero and his ark is fundamentally a story about continuity. It asserts that even when a civilization is wiped out, something of it survives. A thread of knowledge, of life, of righteousness is carried forward into the new world. This is a deeply comforting and psychologically necessary message for a culture recovering from a collective trauma. It assures them that they are not a random accident, but the chosen descendants of the virtuous survivors, with a divine mandate to build a new and better world. The ark, therefore, is not just a historical memory of a boat. It is a powerful and sophisticated mythological symbol that encapsulates the human story of survival, hope, and resilience in the face of overwhelming catastrophe. Ultimately, the great flood myths, when viewed through this lens, can be understood as a profound and enduring warning from our distant past. Whether the original Cataclysm was the regional Black Sea deluge, or the global Younger Dryas impact, the message encoded in the myths remains the same. They are a deeply embedded cultural memory, a story passed down for thousands of years to remind us of two fundamental truths: the immense, destructive power of the planet we inhabit, and the profound fragility of human civilization. The stories tell us that the world we take for granted is not necessarily stable. The ground beneath our feet, the oceans, and the skies above are all capable of a violence that can erase our proudest achievements in an instant. The legend of a golden age before the flood, a world of great cities and advanced knowledge, serves as a powerful cautionary tale. It reminds us that no civilization, no matter how powerful or technologically advanced, is immune to the forces of nature. The moral dimension of the myths, the idea that the flood was a punishment for humanity's wickedness, can also be reinterpreted in a modern, secular context. While we may no longer believe that a deity sends floods to punish us, the stories still speak to a deep truth about the relationship between a civilization and its environment. They can be seen as a warning against hubris, a reminder that if a society becomes arrogant, short-sighted, and lives out of balance with the natural world, it risks bringing about its own destruction. The sins of the pre-flood world, the greed, the violence, the corruption, can be seen as metaphors for a society that has lost its way, a civilization on a collision course with reality. The Great Flood myth, therefore, is far more than just a fascinating historical puzzle or a collection of primitive superstitions. It is one of the oldest and most persistent pieces of wisdom our species possesses. It is a story that has survived for millennia because it speaks to our deepest fears and our most profound hopes. It is a reminder that we are the descendants of survivors, that our very existence is a testament to the resilience of those who endured the last great cataclysm. And it is a warning that the forces that destroyed the world of our ancestors are not gone. They are merely dormant. The myths challenge us to look at our own world, with its rising sea levels, its changing climate, and its ever-present potential for both natural and self-inflicted disaster, and to ask ourselves if we are heeding the lessons of our most ancient story. Are we living as though we are immune to catastrophe, or are we remembering the wisdom of the flood? That survival depends on foresight, resilience, and a deep and abiding respect for the awesome power of the world we call home? The stories of the Great Flood are woven into the very fabric of our oldest cultures. While science may debate the exact causa regional deluge or a global impact, the evidence suggests that these are not just fantasies. They are likely the echoes of a real, terrifying catastrophe that reshaped the world and was seared into the memory of our species. The myths may be a message from our deep past, a reminder that the world we know can be washed away in an instant. If the past still whispers to you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Ancient Relics Keeper, because some mysteries were never meant to be buried.